Welcome out to Sunday school. In this Memorial Day weekend, Book of Job. Book of Job. Say the book of Job, however you want to find it. As you're finding the book of Job, in last week's lesson, we looked at the origin of different people groups and talking about the Tower of Babel and even just the color of folks' skin and different ethnic groups of folks. That was real interesting study in the different family traits, which all that resulted obviously in different characteristics and things. And now we come to the book of Job. So as we look here at the descendants of Shem, we come to the book of Job, and we see that the text was, of course, in the land of Uz. And that was also that Uz was the grandson of Shem through Aram, and likely settled in the region south of the Dead Sea is what our lesson says. And Job likely lived at about the same time around 2100 BC is what it said, which this actually, my Bible actually takes it back further than that. So I think this is, again, one of those things that as you study and maybe read different things. But I know our lesson this morning talks about around 2100 BC. I think my Bible has it around 1520 BC. So it's kind of interesting. But I do love the book of Job, and we're going to dive right in, because if you're going to cover the whole book of Job in Sunday school, that's almost a hard feat to underdo. So looking at the trials of Job, if you will, in chapter number 1, there was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job. That man was perfect and upright, and one that feared God and eschewed evil. There were born unto him 7 sons and 3 daughters. His substance also was 7,000 sheep and 3,000 camels and 500 yoke of oxen and 500 she-asses, and a very great household, so that this man was the greatest of all the men of the east. And his sons went and feasted in their houses every day, or every one his day, and sent and called for their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. Let's read verse number 5. And it was so, when the days of their feasting were gone about, that Job sent and sanctified them, and rose up early in the morning, and offered burnt offerings according to the number of them all. For Job said, it may be that my sons have sinned and cursed God in their hearts. Thus did Job continually. So boy, we've learned a lot about Job here just in the first few verses. Job was a perfect, so that don't mean he was sinless. It just means that he was complete. He was complete and perfect, upright. He was one that feared God and eschewed evil. So he hated anything evil. Job had a wonderful family. He had 7 sons and 3 daughters. That's a wonderful family. He had a great substance: 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, so 500 pair of oxen, and 500 she-asses. So he had a wonderful family, a wonderful home. He had a good business. And Job also, it shows you in verse 5 how much he cared about his family, that he would offer burnt offerings up unto God on their behalf because he was afraid that they had sinned. And it says, thus did Job continually. Now the best way to study the book of Job is to kind of do it in scenes, I think. It's kind of thinking like a play. So we opened up, we've introduced to Job, we've been introduced to his family, to his fortune. The curtains closed. We open back up. Now there was a day in verse 6 that the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan came also among them. And the Lord said unto Satan, whence comest thou? Satan answered the Lord and said, from going to and fro in the earth, and from walking up and down in it. And the Lord said unto Satan, hast thou considered my servant Job? Many times I think there's great sentences and verses in the Bible, and I say that often. I feel like this is one of them. I couldn't imagine today, and quite frankly, I don't know that I want to endure that, but I could not imagine in my own mind that today Satan goes before God and that God would say, "Hast thou considered my servant Matthew?" I think that is one of the most powerful statements ever been said in Scripture. He looked down on earth and said, "Listen, hast thou considered my servant Job?" Now, you say, "Well, I'd like to pat on the back too." Well, it don't stop there. It says, "There's none like him in the earth, a perfect and an upright man, one that feareth God and eschewed evil." And Satan says, "Doth Job fear God for naught? Hast not there," verse 10, "hast not thou made a hedge about him and about his house and about all that he hath on every side? Thou hast blessed the work of his hands, and his substance is increased in the land." He said, listen, he said, God, now this, I'd love to sit there all morning. Think about that. He said, "Hast thou considered my servant Job?" We could say that about anybody in this room this morning. And Satan said, "Well, listen, of course Job serves you." Man, who wouldn't? He's got this great substance. He's got a wonderful family. You've blessed him beyond measure. Job's just serving you. You take all that stuff away from him, he'll curse you. Man, what a accusation. This is an incredible scene. He said, verse 11, "Put forth thine hand now and touch all that he hath, and he will curse thee to thy face. And the Lord said unto Satan, Behold, all that he hath is in thine power. Only upon himself put not forth thine hand." So Satan went forth from the presence of the Lord. So, again, there's so much to say here, and we're just going to go till we're done. But, it encourages us, or it should, to think that, to know, and we do know this, but we see it, that the Lord holds it all in the palm of his hand. And he gave Satan the power to go and to touch everything Job had except for Job himself. And it encourages me, now not that we don't know this, but it encourages me to get reminded of it, that Satan obeyed God. Satan didn't go and start messing with Job, did he? God told him he couldn't. So he told him, said he can go touch all that he has. Now here's the day that, some days we think we have a bad day. Well, maybe we just need to read Job chapter 1 and we decide our day is not that bad. But this is the day that really gets me. Because I know this is where I would get in the flesh right here. And I've always said that, and it's just what Matthew's picked out of here. You may pick something else. But here's where I would start losing it. So there was a day, in verse 13, it says, "And there was a day when his sons and his daughters were eating and drinking wine in their eldest brother's house. And there came a messenger unto Job and said, The oxen were plowing and asses feeding beside them, and the Sabians fell upon them and took them away. Yea, they slain the servants with the edge of the sword, and I'm only left to escape thee." Now, I'd be fine right there. That's fine. It's a bad day. The Sabians have come. They've took the oxen. They've took the asses with them. They've killed the servants. Here's one escaped. At this point, if I'm like Job, if he lived during Abraham's time, maybe he heard about Abraham's SEAL Team 6, 318 men that went down there and fought and got Lot back. I'd be going to get me some help, and I'd say, "Listen, we're going to go show them all about this." Well, but it don't stop. So now the fire of God falls from heaven in verse 16 and burns up the sheep. Then verse 17, the Chaldeans made out in bands and fell upon the camels and carried them away and slain the servants with the sword. And I'm only escaped alone to tell thee. Verse 17. So, up to that point, that's a real bad day. That's a bad day. Let's just be honest. That's worse than getting a bill in the mail you can't pay. This is a bad day. But you still got your family. Everything's good. Now here's a real bad day. Here's the part that I couldn't handle. It says, while he was yet speaking, there came another also and said, this is in verse 18, thy sons and thy daughters were eating and drinking wine in their eldest brother's house, and behold, there came a great wind from the wilderness and smote the four corners of the house, and it fell upon the young men, and they are dead, and I only am escaped alone to tell thee. So right there, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about my flesh. Right there, I'd lose it. Because it even goes on to say that in all this, Job sinned not, verse 22, nor charged God foolishly. And I'm just going to confess something to you this morning. We'll have a little confession time. Right there, I'd lose it. Because I'm telling you, out of my mouth, apart from God stopping my mouth, I would say, are you kidding me, that you just took all 10 of my children and left a servant to escape to come tell me? Couldn't he have died and you saved me one? You might be a better Christian than I am, but I'm telling you, I would have asked. I'm just telling you, it's confession time. I'd have said, listen, out of how many ever people in that house that day, you couldn't have spared one child for me to have and left that crazy servant in that house and took him. I'm telling you, I'd have lost it right there. But in all this, Job, he obviously made his great statement there in verse 21. It says, and he said, naked came I out of my mother's womb, and naked shall I return thither. The Lord gave, and the Lord hath taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. If you ever want to hear one of the greatest sermons ever preached on that verse right there, verse 21, and I've told you this before, but look up E.V. Hill, a black preacher, when he preaches his wife's funeral on Job chapter 1, verse 21. I'm telling you, he preached his wife's funeral out of that one verse, and it's unreal, amazing, powerful. If you've never heard that, you need to listen to it. E.V. Hill. But in all this, Job sinned not, nor charged God foolishly. So then we see that, again, we're going to have to really roll here. But so now, again, there was a day in verse 1 of chapter 2, when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan came also among them to present himself before the Lord. Verse 3, and the Lord said unto Satan, hast thou considered my servant Job, that there's none like him in the earth, a perfect and an upright man, one that feareth God and eschewed evil, and still. Now listen, at this point, I couldn't even handle being considered the first time. Now we're being considered the second time, and God's done added something to Job's resume. It says, listen, everything I've told you the first time, he's he's an upright man, he fears God, he eschews evil, and still he holdeth fast his integrity. Although thou moved me against him to destroy him without cause. And Satan answered the Lord and said, skin for skin, yea, all that a man hath will he give for his life. But put forth thine hand now and touch his bone and his flesh, and he will curse thee to thy face. And the Lord said unto Satan, he is in thine hand, but save his life. So we know what's coming. That's misery, right? So Satan comes and he puts these boils on Job from the top of his head to the sole of his foot. Insomuch that Job sits down and he's scraping himself in the ashes with a potsherd. And you get down to verse number 9 and says, then said his wife unto him, dost thou still retain thine integrity? Curse God and die. Now, I don't want you to be too hard about Job's wife here. You know, I think it's easy sometimes that we pick on Job's wife and think, well, boy, she wasn't like Job, was she? But now, this was, she's a part of this too. And she's just lost 10 kids. She did what Matthew did. I'm just going to tell you. I'll just go ahead and admit. I'll confess for her. She did what Matthew did. She got in the flesh, and Job answers it that way. And Job explains that to us in the next verse. He says in verse 10, but he said unto her, thou speakest as one of the foolish women speaketh. And I really believe that what he's telling her there is not that, woman, you're a fool, you don't even know what you're talking about. No, he's not saying that. He's saying, listen, you're speaking as a foolish woman, as a woman that don't know God, as a woman that's not a Christian. You're not in your right place right now. You just lost all 10 of your children. You're not thinking right. And you're speaking as a foolish woman speaketh. What? Shall we receive good at the hand of God, and shall we not receive evil? And all this did not Job sin with his lips. So boy, Job's doing pretty good, ain't he? I mean, he's hanging in there for us. So we move forward here this morning, and again, I love, the last few weeks I've kind of struggled with some things, just looking at, I'm not very educated, and you start talking about genealogies, and you start talking about things, I get a little, but I love the book of Job. And it's so interesting of what kind of happens next. So after this, we see that Job in verse 11, his three friends heard of all this evil that was come upon him, and they came every one from his own place. And we see Eliphaz and Bildad and Zophar. So they show up. So verse 13, so they sat down with him upon the ground 7 days and 7 nights, and none spake a word unto him, for they saw that his grief was very great. Now, listen, I mean, like, we have a hard time visiting somebody that's lost a loved one at their house to take them some food or to take them some biscuits or some drinks when someone passes away. And we have a hard enough time because we're busy and life gets in the way and things, but we want to do something for that family. So we go, we stay about 30 minutes and we leave. We take some biscuits, we talk to them, we're sorry for your loss. I mean, we're talking 7 days, not a word. Our mind so many times just don't think like the Bible's trying to tell us. 7 days, nothing. They sat there and looked at each other. I guess Job kept scraping his bowls, and nobody said nothing. So after that, then of course, and we do, and I think that even Job's friends were kind of probably a little uneducated to what was kind of really going on here behind the scenes. So I think sometimes we do give them a hard time, but they're easy to pick on, because when they finally do open their mouth, I'm sure Job, if he could tell us now, he wished that they'd have just kept it shut for 7 more days. But so when they finally open their mouth, of course, Job answers first, and he curses the day. So we start in chapter 3. And Job just wants to stay in the darkness. He starts down in verse 11 and 12, asking why. He wishes he was dead over in verse 20, 21, 22. I mean, it starts to tell us here the gravity and anguish that Job was in. Verse 21, which longed for death, but it cometh not, and dig for it more than for hid treasure. I mean, like he is wanting to die. Verse 25 and 26, Job's worst fears became a reality. He says, for the thing, now, and I think about, this burdens me so bad. For the thing which I greatly feared is come upon me, and that which I was afraid of is come unto me. I was not in safety, neither had I rest, neither was I quiet, yet trouble came. I mean, that's like thinking of your worst nightmare has just became a reality. It's amazing. I mean, it's terrible. And it shows you, and when you study the book of Job, it shows you this gravity of what's going on. So now we move forward, and Job here in in chapter number 4. So Eliphaz is the oldest, if you will, and so he's going to give his first discourse. Now Eliphaz, and all of these kind of have their own little quirk about them, but Eliphaz in verse number 5 says, but now it has come upon thee, and thou faintest, it toucheth thee, and thou art troubled. So Eliphaz here is basically saying, listen, God, so at the end of chapter 4, and this is kind of how I've studied Job, maybe somebody else got, but at the end of chapter 4, what Eliphaz, and we're not going to read all these for time's sake, but basically is saying, he says, listen, God's just judging you to make you a better person, and from where I'm looking right now, you're not doing a real good job. You're kind of sitting here, you know. So obviously they're not as educated or not as smart as what Job is on the things of God, because God's already said that in all these things, Job hasn't cursed him with his lips. He's not charged God foolishly. But now this friend comes by and says, listen, you're going through this. God's testing you, and from where I'm standing, you're not passing the test. You're failing. This is terrible. I mean, wow, what a friend, right? So Eliphaz continues to go on here, and we carry through, back and forth between Job and him, and I mean, it's a wonderful study. We just don't have time. I can't take you through each one. So now we go forward to Bildad, chapter number 8. So Bildad here, it's his turn to speak, so he's probably the second eldest. He said, verse 2 of chapter 8, how long wilt thou speak these things, and how long shall the words of thy mouth be like a strong wind? Doth God pervert judgment, or doth the Almighty pervert justice? He said, listen, he said, God don't mess up. He said, if you're saying you're so righteous and that you're not done anything, then what's this? Now listen, I mean, I'm telling you, do not do this in a funeral line. Listen, don't do this. He says, verse 4, if thy children have sinned against him, and he have cast them away for their transgression. He said, listen, if you're so good, then obviously your children sinned, or they wouldn't have all died. I mean, man, that ain't true. That there shows you their intellect. Boy, with friends like Job's, who needs enemies? I mean, so they're going back and forth here. There's Bildad's accusation. Bildad, when you study Bildad's life, and we won't do it here, but Bildad is a legalist. So when you study legalism in the Bible, then you can link it back to Bildad. That's pretty much what he is. He's a legalist. Bildad was bad about taking nature's law and trying to apply it to man. So one interesting thing happens here when Job answers Bildad. And this is one of my favorite parts here is in chapter 9. So Job's answering Bildad, and he gives a good example here. And he says, through all this chapter, he says, man, I'm struggling because I want to go to God for help. I think I'm getting charged wrong. I think that God's helping me, but yet I really want to take my case somewhere else. And this is where I always refer back to the Andy Griffith show where the lady's speeding down the road. And you remember Andy and Barney, I think they'd just come out from fishing. The woman drives down the road. She's flying by them. They hop in the police car. They go down the dirt road. They pull her over. And she's like, ma'am, you're speeding, And she's like, I demand. He says, I'm the sheriff in Mayberry, and you're going to get a ticket. She said, I demand to see the justice of the peace, which is a judge like you and I would know, at once. So the scene closes. It opens back up in the courthouse, remember? Andy sits down, says, Sheriff. He sits down, he flips his thing around, and it says, Justice of the Peace. He does that in a couple other episodes too. Same way. This is what Job reminds me of. He says, listen, so if I want to go plead my case before a judge, I walk into the courtroom and God's the judge. Well, then I look over at the jury, and he's the jury. And he says, everything that I do, like the one I want to plead the case to, it's always God. And now I'm kind of thinking maybe my friends are getting to me a little bit here, and I want to plead my case, but I can't because my case is God, and it's against God, and He's the judge, the jury, the executioner here. And he says in verse 32 of chapter 9, "For he is not a man as I am, that I should answer him, and that we should come together in judgment. Neither is there any daysman betwixt us that might lay his hand upon us both." So what he's saying here is Job's saying this. He says, listen, if there was only a daysman, a go-between me and God, somebody that could bridge the gap, that could link up us two, that could put their hand on me and their hand on God, and man, this lawyer could plead my case. And I remember I had never heard that until I actually studied the book of Job on my own one time, and I had never heard anybody preach or teach out of that, and I saw it for the first time myself. And thought, oh my goodness. I mean, have you ever heard anything like that before? I mean, that is the perfect picture of Jesus Christ. We're sinful man. Nothing we can do in ourselves can get us before a holy God. God's holy. He can't change. He can never let sin into His presence. We got a problem. But only if there was a daysman, a go-between, a lawyer between us. And we know from reading the Bible, and we know from coming to church, and we know because most of you saved in here this morning, that that's Jesus Christ. And that He bridges that gap. And Job said, boy, that's what I need. And so again, we keep going. So Bildad, they go back and forth here a little while. We get to old Zophar over in chapter number 11. Zophar's basically, he calls Job a hypocrite. Zophar was angry. So by the time Zophar doesn't sit there for 7 days, then he sat there through Eliphaz's discourse. He sat there through Bildad's discourse. Now he's done so mad he can't stand it. You know how you are when you want to say something you can't, and you've been sitting there and you've been listening to everybody else talking, and finally it's your turn to talk, and it's like, here we go. Well, he's that guy. And he's like, listen. He said, Job, he said, you're nothing but a hypocrite. He actually, down in verse 2 through down about verse 4 of chapter 11, calls Job a windbag. I mean, he's like, listen, you're blowing hot air, Job. Job, you're guilty. You're guilty of sin. You have told us lies. God wouldn't do this to just somebody righteous. Man, you've messed up and you've been lying to us, friend. So Zophar goes through his discourse here back and forth with Job, just like everybody else does. There's a great declaration of faith in chapter 13. Job continues talking, and he keeps going here. I'm not really following the lesson at this point because I didn't know I couldn't. We just kind of got to go through this one at a time. But Job's answering. I think then there's some second discourses and from Eliphaz and from Bildad and so on and so forth. Bildad, we're just going to keep going here over verse 19, or chapter 19, chapter 19, verse 1 and 2. Then Job answered and said, how long will ye vex my soul and break me in pieces with words? Finally, he's like, listen, guys, y'all killing me here. He said, I feel like a besieged city. He's still crying for an advocate. In chapter 19, verse 14, he says, my kinfolk have failed, and my familiar friends have forgotten me. They that dwell in mine houses and my maids count me for a stranger. I am an alien in their sight. I called my servant, and he gave me no answer. I entreated him with my mouth. My breath is strange to my wife. Though I entreated for the children's sake of mine own body, yea, young children despised me. I arose and they spake against me. So he's saying, listen, the way others, his friends, his family, that's the way they're looking at him right now. I mean, that's telling you, I mean, this is bad. Job pleads with his friends. Job's going back and forth again with Zophar and with Eliphaz. I mean, man, they've got a bunch of backs and forths. And so now we get to a chapter here, chapter 29. So all this back and forth, I think we're up to about 8 times that Job's answered them. We go through this back and forth, and in chapter 29, I encourage you sometime to go through there and circle, if you mark in your Bible, all the I's, the me's, the my's, the mine's, because that's when Job really starts saying, well, wait a minute. Let's look at this. I'll show you what I'm talking about. It says, verse 2, chapter 29, "Oh, that I were as in months past, as in the days when God preserved me, when his candle shined upon my head, and when by his light I walked through darkness, as I was in the days of my youth." Verse 5, "When the Almighty was yet with me, when my children were about me, when I washed my steps with butter, and the rock poured me out rivers of oil." As you're seeing here, there's a lot of I's and my's and me's. Job kind of starts boasting here. And I can be kind of hard on Job, if you will, because we're getting there. Chapter 31. "I made a covenant with mine eyes. Why then should I think upon a maid?" Verse 4. "Doth not he see my ways and count my steps? If I have walked with vanity, or if my foot hath hasted to deceit, let me be weighed in an even balance, that God may know mine integrity." So, again, the whole time, we know what went on behind the scene when we opened it up, that God even told Satan, said, listen, "Hast thou considered my servant Job a perfect and upright, a man that fears God and eschewed evil?" And now he's even holding his integrity after you took everything from him. But just like in our life many times, Job's like, listen, now I'm not really hearing from God the way I think. God's not really answering this as quick as I want him to. My friends have done talked me completely off the ledge here because I was doing pretty good. Now I don't know if my kids have sinned, if I've sinned, if I'm just a hypocrite. And he starts saying, you know what? I'm a pretty good guy. I don't know if I deserve this. I mean, I've held my integrity. I've done right and I know the difference between right and wrong. And boy, he starts thinking, I, me, mine. I mean, we're doing pretty good. And he goes through this. Now, I love Elihu more than anybody. We always talk about Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. But if you ever want a friend to study in the Bible of Job, study Elihu, because I really like him. Now this is the youngest, so he sat here through all this mess and had to listen to it. And this is one of those cases where the youngest man in the room is the smartest, and probably should have spoke first, and we'd have been a lot better off by this chapter. But Elihu, at least if he didn't get it exactly right, he come the closest. So let's look at that, chapter 32. "So these 3 men ceased to answer Job because," what's this? "Because he was righteous in his own eyes." So they quit answering him. "Then was kindled the wrath of Elihu." So let's look at what he says. Let's go over verse 4 of chapter 32. "Now Elihu had waited till Job had spoken, because they were elder than he." So he'd been waiting his turn. Now, he really got to give them a piece of his mind. Verse 8 says, "But there is a spirit in man, and the inspiration of the Almighty giveth them understanding. Great men are not always wise, neither do the aged understand judgment." I wonder where he learned that. Probably after listening to the other three speak, didn't he? Chapter 33, verse 4. "The Spirit of God hath made me, and the breath of the Almighty hath given me life." Verse 9, he's talking about Job. He says, "You say, I am clean without transgression," or Job says, "I am clean without transgression. I am innocent, neither is there iniquity in me." Boy, Job's come a long ways, hasn't he, there, to say, well, now he's righteous in his own eyes. Now he's saying he's not even a sinner. And I like to show that because I think it shows the Job here as he progresses, and I think it's important. So we better move quick. We're about out of time. So Elihu and Job go back and forth. I would interest you in studying that because I think that the next few chapters is very important. Elihu says a lot of good things in there. He keeps going. So now we get over to chapter 38, and God speaks. Chapter 38 says, "Then the Lord answered Job out of a whirlwind and said, Who is this that darkeneth counsel by words without knowledge? Gird up now thy loins like a man, for I will demand of thee, and answer thou me." If you ever think that it's all about you and all about me, and we get to that point in our life, it might be good to read this chapter then as well, because look at what God's telling him. He says, listen, gird up thy loins now like a man, for I'll demand of thee an answer. He said, "Where wast thou when I laid the foundations of the earth? Declare if thou hast understanding. Who hath laid the measure thereof, if thou knowest, or who hath stretched the line upon it?" You know, who plumb bobbed the earth? Was it you, Job, or was it me? Verse 7, "When the morning stars sang together, and all the sons of God shouted for joy, or who shut up the sea with the doors when it brake forth, as if it had issued out of the womb?" Verse 11, "And said, Hitherto shalt thou come, but no further, and here shalt thou proud waves be stayed." So I always like that going into summertime. So again, when you go to the beach, wave crashes on the ocean, God says you can go this far and then you got to go back. That's what he's telling him there. So was you there when I decided that? Goes through snow. It goes through animals. Goes through peacocks and unicorns and grasshoppers and eagles in chapter 39. Job speaks a little bit, and then God gets right back in on him again. Talks about Behemoth. Talks about Leviathan. So we keep going, and God's just giving Job what for, ain't he? He's saying, listen, can you do any of these things? You said that you're righteous and you're a great person and that I've been bad to you, so do you have an arm like God? Have you understood all these things? So then we get to chapter 42. It says, "Then Job answered the Lord and said, I know that thou canst do everything, and that no thought can be withholden from thee. Who is he that hideth counsel without knowledge? Therefore have I uttereth that I understood not, things too wonderful for me which I knew not. Here I beseech thee that I will speak, I will demand of thee, and declare thou unto me. I have heard of thee by the hearing of my ear, but now mine eye seeth thee, wherefore I abhor myself and repent in dust and ashes." He said, listen, Lord, I see now what you're talking about. Man, I'm nothing. I hate myself and I'm repenting. Now, just if you think that I'm being hard on Job's three friends, let's read down in verse number 7. It says, "And it was so that after the Lord had spoken these words unto Job, that the Lord said to Eliphaz the Temanite, My wrath is kindled against thee and against thy two friends." Notice he didn't mention Elihu there. That's the other thing. I think Elihu had it right. says, "For ye have not spoken of me the thing that is right, as my servant Job hath. Therefore take unto you now 7 bullocks and 7 rams, and go to thy servant Job, and offer up yourselves a burnt offering, and my servant Job shall pray for you. For him will I accept." You know, no matter what other people thinks, it's probably not saying it right, but God's going to get the last laugh. You know, they came and said, "Job, your children sinned, you've sinned, you're a hypocrite." Now God's reminding them, said, "You think you're so good, you just go down there, Job's going to pray for you." How about that? "And the Lord turned," verse 10, "and the Lord turned the captivity of Job," notice this, "when he prayed for his friends. Also the Lord gave Job twice as much as he had before." Verse 12, "So the Lord blessed the latter end of Job more than his beginning, for he had 14,000 sheep, 6,000 camels, 1,000 yoke of oxen, 1,000 she-asses. He had also 7 sons and 3 daughters." Verse 15, "And in all the land were no women found so fair as the daughters of Job. And their father gave them inheritance among their brethren. After this lived Job 140 years, and saw his sons and his sons' sons, even 4 generations. So Job died, being old and full of days." So again, God gave him back twice as much, but I'll tell you, don't ever forget, as we've talked about in the past, we don't know if gestation was a little shorter then or not, but I'm pretty sure God didn't just wave a magic wand and give him 10 kids. I think if God would have done that, he'd have told us. So just remember that when God's trying to give you back that which he may have took from you, that I don't know about you, but that's a lot of diapers to be changing and starting all over again. But again, God was trying to bless him, and you know, Mrs. Job ended up with 20 kids in her life. But that's pretty wild, isn't it? But I hope you enjoyed that this morning. Now we got to refresh and go preach again here in a minute. So